The courtroom was bustling that morning, filled with reporters, spectators, and attorneys, all anticipating the start of a significant trial. The case had attracted attention for weeks, drawing the eyes of the public and press alike. In the midst of this, a young black attorney made her way into the room, her shoulders straight and her gaze focused. She was here for a high-profile case, one that could make or break her career. The courtroom was filled with chatter and murmurs, but as she entered, a few heads turned, watching her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The judge, known for his no-nonsense attitude and strict approach to the law, eyed her as she approached the front. He was a seasoned figure in the legal world, well-respected but known for being skeptical of newcomers. His glance at her seemed cold, assessing, and perhaps a bit dismissive. She felt the weight of his stare and the assumptions that seemed to linger in the air. The veteran attorney on the opposing side, with years of experience and a reputation for aggressive tactics, didn't seem to take her very seriously either. She could sense that he saw her as an easy opponent. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the journey that led her here. Years of late nights studying, challenges, and countless hours in law school had all built up to this moment. This case was her chance to prove her abilities, not just to the judge or the opposing attorney, but to everyone who doubted her. Her calm demeanor didn't reveal the nerves bubbling inside. Despite the tension in the room, she was determined to do her best, for herself and for her client who depended on her skills. As the trial began, she presented her case clearly and confidently. She knew her arguments were solid, and her understanding of the details was thorough. But each time she raised an objection or made a point, the judge's skeptical tone seemed to come down on her harder than usual. When she voiced her argument, he interrupted to question her reasoning, his tone carrying a hint of condescension. It was subtle but noticeable. Anyone watching could tell he wasn't giving her the benefit of the doubt. She felt the pressure mounting. Her opponent, aware of the judge's attitude, seized the opportunity to undermine her further, challenging her statements more aggressively than he might have with another attorney. It felt as if every move she made was being scrutinized. Inwardly, she questioned whether the judge's doubts stemmed from her relative inexperience, her background, or something else. But she kept her composure, responding to each challenge calmly, never letting her frustration show. At the end of the day, she sat alone in the empty courtroom, reflecting on the day's events. She knew this was just the beginning of the battle. The judge's doubts and the intense opposition might have rattled her momentarily, but they also lit a fire within her. This wasn't the first time she'd faced doubts or had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. She reminded herself of the reason she'd become an attorney, to stand up for justice and to break down barriers. This case, she realized, was her chance not only to defend her client, but also to prove that she belonged in that courtroom just as much as anyone else. The young attorney sat at her desk the next morning, reviewing her notes and planning her next steps. She knew she'd have to work twice as hard to prove herself in that courtroom. The judge's attitude had been hard to ignore, and his questioning, at times, felt less about her arguments and more about her ability to handle the case. She couldn't shake the feeling that his doubts went deeper than just the facts of the case. But she had a client who depended on her, and she wasn't about to let personal judgments from anyone interfere with her work. She took a deep breath, steadied her mind, and prepared herself to face another challenging day in court. Entering the courtroom, she noticed her client watching her closely. He was young, nervous, and facing serious charges, and she could sense he was also uncertain about her ability to defend him. She could feel his worry as he studied her, wondering if he'd made the right choice in trusting her with his future. His family sat a few rows behind him, their eyes filled with hope and concern, clearly holding on to the chance that she could help him. It was a lot of pressure, but she pushed those thoughts aside, reminding herself why she became an attorney in the first place. The opposing attorney was already at his table, organizing his files with a look of calm confidence. He'd been practicing law for decades and had a reputation for being relentless in court. To him, this case might have been just another win to add to his record. She sensed that he wasn't expecting much of a fight from her and perhaps even felt he already won. She couldn't deny the challenge he posed, but she knew she'd prepared thoroughly and wasn't here to give up. She took her seat and quietly reviewed her notes, blocking out the judge's watchful gaze and the intimidating atmosphere of the courtroom. The judge called the court to order, and the trial resumed. As she presented her evidence and arguments, she could feel the tension in the room. Each time she spoke, she sensed that she was being evaluated not just for the case, but as a professional. The judge's reactions remained cold, and every argument seemed to be met with skepticism. He questioned her at almost every turn, often in a way that made her feel as though he doubted her capability to handle the case. It felt unfair, as if he was holding her to a different standard, yet she stayed focused, responding carefully and precisely. Her client, sitting beside her, began to fidget as the day wore on. He whispered to her during a break, asking if everything was going okay and if she thought they could win. She could see the fear in his eyes. He was counting on her, but her calm confidence was being tested by the judge's constant questioning and her opponent's smirking certainty. She offered a few words of reassurance, telling him she was doing everything she could to build their case, but inside, she knew she needed to do more to convince him, and the judge, that she could see this through. As the court session ended that day, she packed her things, mentally preparing herself for the work ahead. She was determined not to let any doubts or judgments deter her. Deep down, she knew that the only way to change minds was to keep going, to stay strong, and to keep building her case step by step. After another tense day in court, the young attorney returned home, feeling the weight of the judge's doubts and her client's uncertainty pressing down on her. She knew this case wasn't just about winning for her client. It was also about proving that she belonged in this field, that she was as capable and deserving as anyone else. But the judge's reactions seemed to suggest he didn't share that belief. She tried to ignore it, but those glances, those subtly dismissive comments, it all added up, leaving her feeling as if she had to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent. She thought back to her journey, everything that had brought her here. Growing up, she hadn't known any lawyers, especially not ones who looked like her. But from a young age, she'd had a sense of fairness, a desire to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. That spark had led her to law school, where she'd pushed through long nights and tough classes, determined to make a difference. She'd come so far, yet here she was, facing a judge who seemed to question her every move and an opponent who didn't see her as a real threat. In the quiet of her apartment, she flipped through her trial notes, scanning each line and mentally reviewing her next steps. But as she looped through the case, her thoughts drifted to her family and friends who had always believed in her. They'd encouraged her through law school, celebrated her achievements, and were endlessly proud of her accomplishments. They knew how hard she'd worked to reach this point. Their support was always in her heart, and tonight, she needed to remember it. Then there was her client. The young man sitting beside her in court each day was counting on her to fight for him. She could see the nervousness in his eyes, the hope mixed with fear. He trusted her with his case, and she knew he was afraid of what might happen if things didn't go in their favor. His family, who showed up every day, never missing a moment, clearly believed in her too. They looked at her with a kind of silent hope, and she felt the pressure to be the strong advocate they needed. She knew she couldn't let doubts, or anyone else's opinions, shake her confidence. This was her case, and she'd prepared tirelessly for it. No amount of skeptical looks or dismissive tones would make her back down. She felt a renewed determination to prove her skills, not just to the judge but to herself. She wasn't going to let anyone's doubts define her. The next morning, she arrived at court earlier than usual, determined to stay focused and give this case everything she had. She organized her notes, took a deep breath, and reminded herself why she was here. She wasn't just fighting for her client. She was fighting to break down barriers, to show that she was more than capable of handling cases like this. As she waited for the judge and the opposing attorney to arrive, she felt a surge of energy. She was ready to give it her all, no matter what anyone thought. When the judge finally entered and the trial resumed, she delivered her arguments with even greater clarity and confidence. She knew the facts, she'd done her research, and she was prepared for any challenge. This time, when the judge questioned her, she stood her ground, answering each query with precision. She felt her confidence growing with every word. The day was supposed to be her turning point. The young attorney had spent hours preparing, going over every detail of her argument, making sure she had anticipated any objections. She felt ready, and she hoped today would finally be the day when the judge and everyone else in the courtroom would see her for the skilled attorney she truly was. Her confidence was growing, and as she took her seat, she was determined to keep her focus strong. But things quickly took an unexpected turn. As soon as the trial began, the opposing attorney began to press harder, using his years of experience to challenge her at every possible moment. He questioned her evidence and attempted to undermine her points, making the process as difficult as possible. Each time she presented something, he found a way to cast doubt on it, and the judge seemed to be listening to his words more carefully than hers. The courtroom tension was almost palpable. It was clear her opponent wasn't holding back, using every tactic to make her case look weak. The judge, maintaining his skeptical demeanor, didn't give her any room to make mistakes. He questioned her reasoning and the sources of her evidence, at times stopping her mid-sentence to clarify things that didn't need clarification. It felt as though he was testing her, perhaps waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake he could use as proof that she wasn't ready for a case of this magnitude. Her confidence took a small hit with each comment, but she kept her focus, determined not to show any sign of frustration or doubt. Her client looked over at her during a short break, his face full of worry. He was starting to sense the uphill battle they were facing. Although she tried to reassure him with a calm nod, she could feel his trust beginning to waver. He was young, facing serious accusations, and he put his faith in her hands, believing she could help him. Seeing the doubt in his eyes weighed on her, but it also strengthened her resolve. She wasn't going to let him down. No matter how tough the battle was, she would stand by him and give everything she had. As the day wore on, she began to feel the pressure building. Every move she made felt like it was being carefully watched, and she couldn't shake the sense that the judge was still judging her on something beyond her arguments. She felt a mix of frustration and determination. She knew she'd prepared well and that her arguments were solid, but the judge's critical eye and the relentless tactics of her opponent were wearing on her. Yet she stayed firm, keeping her voice steady and her arguments clear, refusing to let any hint of her frustration show. She knew that showing any sign of weakness would only give the judge more reason to doubt her. As the session neared its end, she took one final deep breath and focused on her closing remarks, making sure each word was delivered with conviction. She spoke not only for her client, but for herself, as a reminder of her strength and ability. When court was finally adjourned for the day, she packed up her files and walked out, still feeling the tension of the day, but also the steady beat of determination. She knew the road ahead was long, but she was determined to keep fighting, no matter how tough the challenge. This case was her chance to show what she was truly made of, and she wasn't about to let anyone or anything stop her from proving it. After a long and challenging week in court, the young attorney felt drained, but still determined to push forward. The case was far from over, and each day had felt like a battle. The judge's subtle disapproval, the opposing attorney's constant challenges, and the weight of her client's trust in her made every minute in that courtroom feel intense. But she reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't just fighting for her client. She was proving her dedication to the law, even in the face of doubters. Yet, she couldn't deny that it was wearing on her. On her way out of the courthouse one evening, a senior court clerk she'd often seen around the hallways stopped her. The clerk was older, with years of experience in the courthouse, and she seemed to have a warm, knowing look in her eyes. She had seen many lawyers come and go over the years, and something about her gaze felt steady and comforting. She paused for a moment, then gave the young attorney a small, encouraging smile. "You're doing well, you know," the clerk said, her voice low but full of reassurance. "Not everyone gets such a tough trial on their hands so early on. But you're handling it better than most would." The attorney was taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her struggles, let alone offer encouragement. The clerk's words felt like a lifeline, something she didn't realize she needed. She had been so focused on each challenge and each criticism that she hadn't stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, she was doing a good job. That small bit of support from someone with so much experience lifted her spirits in a way she hadn't anticipated. Back at home that evening, she found herself replaying the clerk's words in her mind. It gave her a fresh perspective. Yes, the judge had his doubts, and yes, the opposing attorney was skilled and relentless. But she realized that she'd made it this far, that she was still standing and still pushing forward despite everything. She knew her arguments, she prepared her evidence, and she was there for a reason. She decided, in that moment, that she would walk into court the next day with her head held high, focusing on her strengths rather than letting doubts creep in. The next morning, as she entered the courtroom, she noticed a shift in her own attitude. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just reacting to what the judge or her opponent said. She was leading with her own confidence. Each time she spoke, she did so with conviction, letting her arguments flow naturally. When her opponent tried to trip her up, she answered calmly, without letting frustration show. She realized that by focusing on her strengths and not on others' opinions, she was able to command the courtroom in a new way. As the trial continued, she saw small changes in how people responded to her. The judge, while still skeptical, seemed to pause a little longer before dismissing her points. Her opponent was no longer as smug, clearly noticing that she was holding her ground. Even her client seemed to sit a little taller, sensing her renewed confidence. She could feel the subtle shift, and it gave her a sense of hope. She might not have changed everyone's mind yet, but she was starting to see that perseverance could wear down even the toughest of doubts. For the first time since the trial had started, she left the courthouse feeling proud. She was still facing an uphill battle, but she could feel that things were changing, if only a little. The support from the clerk had reminded her that, no matter the challenges, she had the strength to keep moving forward. And she knew she would do just that. As the trial went on, the young attorney felt a shift within herself, a growing confidence that had been missing in the early days of the case. She had always known she was capable, but the daily struggles in the courtroom had made her question her abilities. Now, with each passing day, she began to trust herself more. Her arguments were stronger, her voice more assured, and her belief in her cause clearer than ever. The courtroom, which had once felt like an intimidating battlefield, was starting to feel like a space where she could truly show what she was made of. The judge, who had seemed so skeptical at the start, was now pausing longer before reacting to her points. There was still an edge of doubt in his eyes, but she could sense that he was beginning to take her more seriously. She hadn't won him over completely, but he was listening more carefully, perhaps recognizing her resilience and her dedication. She wasn't just another young attorney making her way through a tough case. She was a determined advocate fighting for what she believed was right. Her opponent, on the other hand, had not been as welcoming of her newfound confidence. He had grown more aggressive, clearly uncomfortable with the way she was holding her ground. His usual tactics of questioning and trying to undermine her were no longer as effective. Instead of rattling her, he only seemed to strengthen her resolve. Each time he tried to find a hole in her argument, she filled it with even stronger evidence and sharper reasoning. It was clear that he was starting to take her more seriously, which, in a strange way, felt like a victory in itself. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, the young attorney was reviewing her notes in the courthouse lobby when she was approached by one of her colleagues. This was someone who had worked alongside her in the past, someone who had witnessed her growth as a lawyer. She had always admired this colleague's ability to handle even the most difficult cases with grace and precision. Now, as this colleague stood before her, she could see the respect in their eyes. "You're doing an amazing job," her colleague said, their voice sincere. "I've been watching you in court. The way you've handled yourself is impressive. You've earned that judge's attention, and I think you're really turning the case around." The compliment took her by surprise. She had been so focused on the fight in front of her that she hadn't noticed how far she had come. To hear someone acknowledge her work in such a straightforward way felt like a breath of fresh air. The weight she had been carrying for so long, trying to prove herself, suddenly felt a little lighter. As she left the courthouse that evening, the young attorney couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face, but she was no longer afraid of them. With each compliment, each small victory in the courtroom, she grew stronger. She could feel the shift inside her, the knowledge that she belonged in this space. When she returned home, she called her family to give them an update on how the case was going. Her mother, who had always been her biggest cheerleader, was excited to hear the good news. "You're doing it, aren't you?" her mother said, her voice full of pride. "You're showing them all just how amazing you are." Her words felt like a reminder of everything she had worked for, everything that had brought her to this point. She had always known that her journey wouldn't be easy, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. With renewed determination, she promised herself she wouldn't let this case be the last time she proved her worth. This was just the beginning. As the trial continued, the young attorney found herself feeling more in control of the situation. Her client, who had once seemed uncertain about her abilities, was now watching her with renewed hope. The confidence she had slowly built was starting to shine through, and it felt like the entire courtroom was beginning to take notice. Even the judge, who had been the most skeptical of her, was no longer dismissing her arguments as easily. He listened more attentively, and his questions, while still probing, seemed more like a challenge than an attempt to undermine her. The opposing attorney, too, was showing signs of frustration. His tactics, which had worked so well early in the trial, were now falling flat. Every time he tried to catch her off guard or throw her off balance, she responded with calm precision. She had learned to stay one step ahead, anticipating his moves and always having a solid answer ready. It wasn't that he had stopped trying to win the case. It was just that she had grown into her role as a lawyer, and it was clear that she wasn't going to back down. One day, during a short break, her client pulled her aside. He had been sitting quietly through the trial, but today, something in his eyes had changed. There was a new kind of trust there, something that hadn't been present before. "I just want to say thank you," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I wasn't sure about you at first, but you've really shown me what you're capable of. I'm glad you're my attorney." Her heart swelled at his words. She had always believed in herself, but hearing it from him, someone who had been uncertain of her in the beginning, was different. It was a reminder that she was making a difference, that her hard work and dedication were paying off. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself or her career. She was fighting for this young man's future too, and that made everything worth it. As the trial entered its final stages, the young attorney's nerves had transformed into determination. She knew the end was near, but she also knew that the last steps would be the hardest. Every closing argument needed to be perfect. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Her client was counting on her, and so was everyone who had believed in her, including the clerk who had offered those words of encouragement, and her family who had supported her from the very beginning. The day of the closing arguments arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. She sat at the defense table, papers neatly stacked in front of her, breathing deeply as she prepared to make her final statement. The judge, the opposing attorney, her client, and the few others in the room were all focused on her now, waiting to hear what she had to say. She had spent hours crafting her words, choosing every one with care. This was her moment to leave it all on the table, to show just how much she had grown in this process, and to prove to everyone including herself, that she was capable of handling this case. When her turn came, she stood up, her legs a little shaky, but her heart strong. She spoke slowly at first, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. She reminded the court of the facts, but more importantly, she spoke from the heart. She didn't just present the evidence, she shared the story of her client, of why he deserved a chance at a future, of why the truth mattered. She made it clear that this wasn't just a legal case for her. It was about fairness, about standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was. As she finished her closing statement, she took a moment to breathe, her eyes scanning the room. She had said everything she needed to say. Now, all she could do was wait. The room was silent after the young attorney finished her closing argument. Her words hung in the air, each one carefully chosen, each one carrying the weight of everything she had fought for. She felt the eyes of the judge, her opponent, and even her client on her. They were all waiting for something, and for the first time in the trial, it felt like everything had paused. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about the connection she had made, the conviction with which she spoke. She had poured her heart into this case, and she knew that no matter what happened next, she had done her best. The opposing attorney stood next, giving his own closing argument, but the young attorney barely heard his words. She was too focused on her own thoughts, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought back to the long nights of preparation, the doubts she had pushed through, and the support from her family and colleagues that had kept her going. She had faced so many challenges, but she had learned from each one. And now, standing before the court, she knew she was stronger because of it. Her client, who had once looked at her with uncertainty, now sat up straighter, watching her with respect. She could feel that shift in him, the change in how he saw her. In the beginning, he had been unsure whether she was the right person for the job. But now, he knew she was. That was what mattered to her most, that despite everything, he had trusted her, and she had delivered. No matter what the outcome, she had given him everything she had. The judge listened intently as the opposing attorney spoke, but it was clear that the atmosphere in the room had changed. The usual tension that had filled the courtroom was now mixed with a sense of anticipation. It was almost as if everyone was waiting for something more than just a decision. They were waiting for a conclusion to this long, drawn-out battle. A conclusion that would tell them whether this young attorney, still early in her career, was truly ready for the weight of the cases she would face in the future. As the opposing attorney wrapped up, the judge signaled for the session to adjourn, and everyone stood. The young attorney gathered her notes, feeling the familiar nerves creep up again. She had said what she needed to say, but now it was in the judge's hands. She knew this was just one moment in a much longer journey, but it felt different this time. It felt like she had made a real impact. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with people talking about the case. But the young attorney wasn't listening. She stepped outside into the cool air, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than it had ever been. It was over for now, but she knew she had given everything she could. She had spoken from the heart, used her knowledge, and stood strong in the face of doubt. Whether or not she won, she had done it with integrity and passion. Later that day, as the judge deliberated, the young attorney sat with her client, waiting for the final verdict. Her phone buzzed, and it was a message from her family. "We're proud of you no matter what happens today." The message brought tears to her eyes. It was a reminder that, win or lose, she was never alone in this journey. She had her family, her friends, and her own strength to lean on. That, more than any victory, was what mattered most. The waiting seemed endless, but finally, the courtroom doors opened. The judge was ready to announce his decision. The young attorney stood tall, taking a deep breath. No matter the outcome, she had proven to herself, and to others, that she was capable of so much more than anyone had believed at the start. And that, she realized, was the true victory. The sound of the courtroom doors opening broke the silence, and everyone stood as the judge entered. The young attorney's heart raced again, a familiar mix of excitement and nerves flooding her chest. Her client sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly, and she could feel his tension as well. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had given her all, said what needed to be said, and now all she could do was wait. The judge sat down, glanced at his papers, and then looked up at the room. His eyes briefly met the young attorney's, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, perhaps respect, or at least acknowledgement of her effort. But the moment passed quickly, and he cleared his throat to speak. After careful consideration of the evidence presented in this case, the judge began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision he was about to make. I have come to a conclusion. The room was completely still. The opposing attorney, who had been so confident in the beginning, seemed a little more tense now. The young attorney felt her pulse quicken as the judge went on. She wasn't sure what was coming, but she had a feeling the outcome might be closer than anyone had expected. The judge looked at her client, then back at her, before continuing. While the case presented some complexities, the defense has shown compelling evidence and made persuasive arguments. Therefore, I find in favor of the defendant. The words hung in the air for a moment before they fully sank in. The young attorney felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had won. She couldn't believe it at first. After all the long days of preparation, all the doubt she had fought, she had managed to turn the case around. She had proven herself, not just to the judge or the courtroom, but to herself. The hard work, the late nights, the persistence, it had all paid off. Her client's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. He stood up quickly, shaking her hand with a grateful smile. She could see the appreciation in his eyes, and it meant more to her than any victory in court. She had done what she set out to do, not just win a case, but change someone's life. It wasn't just about the outcome. It was about what she had learned, how much she had grown, and the person she had become through this entire experience. As she walked out of the courtroom with her client, she couldn't help but smile. She had faced a tough trial, and even though there were still many obstacles ahead, this moment felt like a huge step forward. It wasn't just the win that mattered, it was how much she had changed along the way. She had doubted herself, but through it all, she had found her strength. Later that evening, as she sat with her family, celebrating the victory, she realized that this wasn't the end of her journey, but just the beginning. This case had challenged her, pushed her limits, and shown her what she was capable of. She knew there would be more tough days ahead, more challenges to face. But now, she was ready. She had proven that she could rise above the doubts, and that no matter how tough the case, she would never back down. As she looked around the room at her family's proud faces, she realized that the true victory wasn't in the judge's ruling, but in the confidence she had built, the trust she had earned, and the belief she now had in herself. This case had shown her that, no matter where she started or what people thought, she had the power to make her mark in the world of law. And this was just the beginning.